Dexter Dalwood. I'm an artist, and I'm standing in the English painting room in the National Gallery just before I give a talk about English painting.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Priyesh Mistry. I'm the Associate Curator for Contemporary Projects here at the National Gallery. I've got this enviable job of working with living artists to commission them to hold talks within this fantastic collection here at the National Gallery. This is a fantastic series that we have here called The Unexpected View. It's a program where we invite an artist in to choose a work or choose a room, a part of the collection to talk about the work, but also talk about their own practices and find the kind of relationships between them, the ways that we might understand how both artists work in history, but also how contemporary artists work today in the myriad of ways that they do. Tonight is a very special evening because we are joined by the formidable painter, Dexter Dalwood. You are a formidable painter, no? Brilliant. And Dexter has a very close relationship to the National Gallery, which we'll go into a bit later. But it's great that actually we're standing here in amongst our British pictures, in front of a painting by Joshua Reynolds of a portrait of Captain Robert Orme. It's showing this kind of heroic moment just after a battle, but we're also surrounded by other masterpieces of this kind of British canon. Before I continue and introduce Dexter more formally, we should thank, as ever, Hiscox as the National Gallery's contemporary art partner for their support of this evening. Dexter Dalwood is a British artist renowned for his engagement with contemporary history painting for over 3 decades. Dexter translates real-world events into imagined and composite landscapes. With an acute understanding and referencing of past artistic genres, the language of Dexter's paintings are unique, often evading figurative and immediately legible representational forms in favor of uninhabited and uncertain spatial concerns, shifting scales and compressed picture planes. I hope in our conversation we'll touch on his approach to the idea of history painting as a contemporary genre and the importance of time and memory as touchstones for creating new era-defining images. Dexter now lives and works in Mexico City. In 2017, he undertook a residency in Oaxaca and made a series titled An Inadequate Painted History of Mexico when he returned back to London, which has since featured in touring exhibitions and major solo exhibitions. I was going to go into exhibition history, Dexter, but rather than listing everything, just to say that Dexter shows frequently internationally and is held in many collections, including significant collections here in the UK as well. Dexter has a close relationship with the National Gallery, as I mentioned before, because he sat as a trustee for many years on our board, as well as serving on many other boards in the UK. The Tate's board was a liaison trustee between the 2 museums as well for a period. And his relationship doesn't end since he stopped being a trustee, but continues as Dexter's co-curating an exhibition with my colleague Daniel Ralston on the Mexican landscape painter Jose Velasco, which will open next year.
March, yeah.
In March.
End of March, yeah.
Dexter has just opened an exhibition with a new body of work titled English Painting at the Lisson Gallery, which I encourage you all to go over and see. And that kind of really starts off our kind of conversation here and how we've landed in the British galleries in a way. But I wondered if we could start by talking about that new body of work and why you decided to approach this idea of Englishness. And thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for the introduction, Priyesh. I think it would be good if I kind of just say kind of what started this off, because in a way, by just dropping in, I happen to live in Mexico City actually living in Mexico City for the last 3 years has really been the effect of starting to think about Englishness and the idea of what that could be if I was going to make some paintings related to that. But it really came from a kind of germ of an idea I had a few years ago where the American 20th century painter Alex Katz had done an exhibition in Tate St. Ives. And as part of the thing, when you do an exhibition at Tate St. Ives, you curate a bit of the Tate collection and show works which you pick and put together in a sort of new display. And he picked a painting by Thomas Lawrence painting over there in that right-hand corner. Not that painting, obviously, because it came from Tate. We'll talk about the confusion of British art at Tate and here, and other collections. And he said something which really kind of struck a chord with me in a way. He said that the thing that Lawrence has, he has that inherent thing that English painting has. And that thing is elegance. And when he said that, I thought, I'd never heard an American artist talk about English painting or mention someone, especially like a mid-19th century English painter. And it made me think that thing where actually if you think about quintessentially what is interesting about English art in a way, there is a sort of inherent elegance when it's good. And I think that we're sitting in a room which has some of the hits, if you like. But I think also we should talk a little bit about, behind me is Joshua Reynolds, who was so phenomenally influential in that period in the late 18th century when he released his discourses, these discourses, lectures, which were over a period of time, which he basically came out with this is how you should think about painting, which was also based on a kind of 16th century Italian version of painting, but it was to do with the hierarchy of genres. And this is the thing which I'm kind of interested when we're talking about English painting, Spanish painting, French painting, is what is it? So, and I think that when someone says Spanish painting, for example, you immediately think of Velázquez, Goya, and perhaps even Picasso. And there's not a problem with where you locate it. And I think French painting the same. English painting is more problematic. And one of the reasons it's more problematic because it had several breaks. And I think one of the biggest kind of things, the enormous kind of wounds that happened within English painting in this country was the Reformation, when previously we had an extraordinary country full of churches painted with murals, and when the Reformation came, all that was destroyed and only continued really in illuminated manuscripts. And then in the 16th century, like Henry VIII, it was kind of anti-art in a way, but the artists they did bring to England were mostly from Europe. Yeah. So Holbein comes over, Van Dyck comes over, and the miniature portrait it was the most popular form of art in England for a long, long time. So I think and also in this hierarchy of genres is this odd list, which now seems very antiquated, and the list was, number one was history painting. That was the goal. The goal was to make history painting to the idea that you would include mythological stories, but the whole thing would be to do with an idea of a sort of moral code which lifts the public. And then there was genre painting, which was painting of everyday life, which you could also include Hogarth in that. Then the list kind of starts to go down. We go to portraiture, and obviously portraiture was so important in the 18th and 19th century because it was the only real way that artists made any money, so in terms of commissioned work. Then we have landscape, then we have animal portraiture, and then we have still life. So those are the kind of ascending priority. And landscape painting was not, especially in the late 18th century, early 19th century, was not seen to be an important art to be making. It was a lower category. And what's so interesting now, of course, that in terms of talking about that period of time, that we are, the landscape painters who are basically Constable and Turner, who represent Englishness in terms of the 19th century, now are the most famous artists of this country in terms of that period of history. But yet it wasn't really like that in terms of what was happening in the early 19th century. So I think that's one thing. And the other thing, I think, just before I go on to why I'm kind of thinking about Englishness itself, is that in a way this room, the paintings in this room, are a representation of the power of the Royal Academy when it was in its, if you like, it was in its heyday.
Yeah.
So to become a Royal Academician, there are only 40 of them. If you were in, you got commissions, you got work, and you were basically able to be a professional artist. And if you weren't in, you struggled like crazy. So in a way, the kind of what we see here in terms of acquisitions, in terms of representation of that period, actually is the artists who were, on the whole, members of the RA. And then I think when you think of that period, we haven't got here William Blake, we haven't got Samuel Palmer, we haven't got various other women artists who've been were not seen as part of the canon at that time at all. So in some ways, it's a strange collection as well, because this room represents that, but also if you think of English painting in this country, when it was what's at Tate, for example, what's also in other collections, in private collections and everything else, there's an enormous amount which isn't represented in this room. So in a way, this room is kind of an example of buying power and also the power of the Academy.
And also one that's really tied with the history of the National Gallery as well.
Yeah.
So when the gallery first moved into this building in 1838, I think. 200
years now. Not
well, it was first in a smaller building on Pall Mall before then the founding patrons of the museum petitioned the government to build this building that we're in. And originally, half of the gallery was dedicated to pictures, the founding collection, and the other half was the Royal Academy. And there was this sort of ethos that the collection would be founded for artists, for painters, to learn from the old masters. So when I talk very much about our relationship with contemporary artists, I say it spans back 2 centuries because of that relationship. And in a way, it makes sense for the history of the gallery that many of those Royal Academicians are now also part of the collection hanging here. So it's a story that also relates partly to the history of the gallery and the sort of dynamics of that period as well. The formation of this kind of art network and that economy. It's interesting that we are standing in front of Reynolds because Reynolds, as you mentioned, was one of the founding members of the Royal Academy, but he was also the first president of the Royal Academy. Yeah. And you mentioned his discourses. These were a series of lectures that became a publication that he delivered in his role as the president for the Royal Academy. And he's very much seen as the person to establish what we kind of understand as both that hierarchy, but what English painting might be, and I guess it's from his legacy that we talk about what English painting or British painting might be from then on, because it was seen as the heyday of a kind of reinterpretation of this idea of grand manner painting for a sort of British audience, what it might be to have a Royal Academy, a British Academy in a way of a new style of painting.
Yeah, I think that's true, but also I think it's, if you can move on to talking about history painting, generally it's actually the British weren't particularly good at it. And there's a reason why there aren't any enormous, great, big history paintings in where the French were extremely good at it. Yeah. So it was like, although everybody wanted to aspire to this element, there was also a lot of kind of pomp and nonsense and paintings which are very hard to look at and think about and interpret in a way that portraiture works in a certain way, landscape works in a certain way, because it's accessible. And I think that the interesting thing about history painting, historically, is you had to it was like something you decoded. So you looked at it and you kind of worked out if they were wearing, if they were dressed up in togas or whatever, it was some mythological thing, or if it was some Greek myth. or you had to sort of know that, and you would know that. The audience were basically educated in it, so they come along, they tick it off, oh yeah, it's this and that. But it was a very coded thing, and there were things about this idea of kind of quasi-spirituality, and then also obviously religion comes into it in a different sort of way. But what's so interesting in a way for me was that in England, for example, the Slade School of Art had, up until 1960, they still had an award for history painting, when actually, really history painting ended, in terms of the grand manner, by mid-late 19th century. There wasn't really anyone doing it into the 20th century. So it's interesting that kind of remained as a residual thing. But for me, there are a lot of contemporary 20th century artists who kind of kept that going. And I was very interested in how the difference of, what, if you think about what history painting was, and then what can it be now, it's this idea of that its role is a completely different thing, because now it's the idea of a kind of subjective documentation of something, but also, hopefully, bringing in all these different references to make the viewer think about the relationship of why am I looking at this image now, and what is it making me think about in terms of this event/moment.
How did you first come to it through your work, and how did it first sort of enter into your way of approaching painting?
I think by default, in a way, because I started off, the moment I sort of, things locked into place for me were when I started making these interiors, really, which were sort of historical or sort of 20th century people usually, the idea of making a space which wasn't representing them, it was just the idea of inventing the idea of a fictional room like Solzhenitsyn's reading room, or Paisley Park, which was Prince's recording studio. These were often places I'd read descriptions of, but they weren't actually photographs of. So it was the idea of making a painting which kind of represented that in a way. But I wasn't particularly interested in this idea of history painting until I think I made a very big painting about the death of Brian Jones. He drowned in the swimming pool, slightly mysteriously, in the, I can't remember where it is, it's in the suburb outside London, which was interesting. The house used to be owned by A.A. Milner, who wrote Winnie the Pooh. So it was that example of a kind of weird cross-cultural moment, and I'd used an abstract surface of a painting by Clifford Still, the American abstract painter, to create the wall of the swimming pool. And I think at that moment that someone said to me, you're making contemporary history painting, aren't you? So when I thought, okay, perhaps I am, and then when I started to think about that as the focus, things then kind of really got very exciting, because then there's the idea of how to do a version of something like the deluge, for example. The deluge is like a very common theme and a great one of Turner's, how to do that in a contemporary way. So then the idea was, I think, doing something about Hurricane Katrina or something, and making an enormous painting, and the wave in the painting was a kind of Roy Lichtenstein brushstroke, and it was crashing into a kind of Guston sea. And this idea that, actually also that painting itself has its own history. What I mean by that is that idea that when you see something quoted and recycled, it works in a very different way than it did when it actually came out. So you're historically sampling something and saying, you remember that? You remember that thing? You remember when it had that impact, and now it hasn't got that impact? Like Clifford Still, for example, when he'd made those abstract paintings, he famously said, he had a show in Paris, he said, when those paintings landed in France, they could feel tremors all the way to the Kremlin. The idea that painting had that kind of power, or he thought it did, which now becomes, it's a kind of ridiculous, sort of bombastic joke in a way. Yeah. So that was the sort of, and I became very, very interested in it, and I've written about it as well, actually. But I think what's happened in the last few years, especially when I went to Mexico and then came back and started to make a whole series of paintings which was about Mexican history, which had nothing to do with me, really. And in the end, the show was called that, Este no me pertenece, which means this has nothing to do with me, This doesn't belong to me. Because the idea of like coming from the outside and seeing something, but then also thinking, well, if I was to think about this moment, these moments, these historical moments, how would it work? What would it look like? And how would you use painting to make that an interesting possibility? And then, so when that ended, and I was in Mexico, because I made all those paintings here, then there's this whole thing of, I think the idea of distance, and when you're not connected with the thing you're actually painting and thinking about, but you're distant from it, so it becomes a remove, then there's a whole different thing comes in. So I started this series, this show which is on now, in sort of end of 22, beginning of 23, and it really became an obsession with this thinking about, well, if I was to think about English painting, well, what is it to me? And then, of course, I think the thing with influence is that the mistake of talking about influence in terms of other paintings which influence you as a painter, that's one thing. But actually, for me, the experience of my life is that although painting has been, once I found painting, there was no reverse gear. But at the same time, it's that thing of being able to suddenly play with the form of it, and then, but thinking that, well, I can also include other things, which are all the other things I'm interested in. Because I always thought as an artist, when I was at art school, that the idea, if you get fixed making a type of painting, like if you're the sort of guy, you're the one who does the stripes, you do a degree show and it's the stripe painting person, and then you do that for your MA, but you change it a bit. And then 3 years later, you're kind of still doing kind of stripe, that you get into this cul-de-sac, and that you kind of run out of connecting really with your life in a way that I always thought that making art should be, that you're making stuff that you're interested in. You're interested in the way that, I'm interested in poetry, writing, music, and all those other things, that you can somehow bring that in and make art almost a bit more like a musician, where you're thinking of making an album. So you're making like, okay, I'm going to make these 10, 12 songs, and then when that's done, I might move on and do something else. So it gives you this chance and this possibility to keep working with your imagination and being able to sort of like suddenly alight on a subject, which then you think, oh wow, yeah. So then with this English painting theme, I thought a lot about growing up. I grew up in Bristol. I moved to London when I was 17, and I was in a punk band very briefly. I had like a 18-month meteoric crash and burn career, and also that point in time, which is very exciting to be alive and be a part of it, was also has now, in terms of history, become solidified, and there's a kind of version of it which is now written up. And also in my own lifetime, I don't quite recognize that what I went through, and I think that moment is kind of over. So the first painting in the show is called Punk is Dead, because it's the idea that is, I can guarantee you, whatever that was, is no longer exists. That moment in time finished. And from there, I really started, again, also thinking about the idea of genre painting, because I thought that with including works in a show about English painting, I had to include like a portrait, a landscape, something to do with horses, and also something to do with a kind of spooky kind of, that I think that there's kind of the idea of Englishness as well. It's kind of this slightly, this idea of sort of mystical sort of doom, which kind of creeps in. Do you know what I mean? I think it's in lots of like 19th century poetry, and then of course the pre-Raphaelites, who are, you may notice there's no major inclusion of the pre-Raphaelites in this collection. So where they sit and how people hate or love them is a kind of strange anomaly, but they are also this kind of fantasy art, that a point when artists really wanted to get away and escape and think about a time before, because of what was, the horrific reality of late 19th century industrialization. And also, those things are very interesting for me, because you think about the relationship of history and the moment those people are making work, which either has nothing to do with what they're observing, or is a complete fantasy away from it. I think, and the example of Turner and Constable is a great one, because Turner, in a way, even in these paintings, the Fight and Temeraire, and Wind, Steam, is it here?
Rain, Steam and Speed, yeah.
Over there, are both paintings about that moment in time. One is the end of the idea of the great age of the British Navy in terms of the tall ships. And the other is the advent of the railways, where Constable hasn't got any of that. Constable's just like, I don't want any of it. I'm just like, I like it, I want to keep it as it was when I was a kid, and that's what I want to get. But at the same time, he did, the way he painted was very sort of proto-impressionist and very interesting, but the subject is deliberately against what he's witnessing.
Yeah.
And
go on.
just to bring in the artist we're bringing to the National Gallery next year, Jose Maria Velasco, is why he's so interesting is because he's someone who was completely documenting what was happening in the Valley of Mexico, this idea of the beginning of industrialization, and thinking about the past, and thinking about the idea of the relationship of science to making art. And I think that's another thing, that the underlying sort of research-based practice that goes behind certain artists and doesn't behind others is also a very interesting thing to think about in that period.
But also, I think it's something, I wanted to bring it back to this portrait behind us because I find it quite unusual as a painting. But it's this interesting idea around how artists reference and take from different moments, whether that is about, being influenced by artists that came before them, taking forms. Reynolds was notorious for doing that, from quoting from sort of classical imagery, from the Baroque, from the High Renaissance, and reinterpreting those kind of forms, those gestures, those compositions. There's also this idea of kind of referencing those moments of history, those points of significant moments that might happen within current affairs or within the world as international moments of significance that actually we might be distant from. And perhaps this is a kind of a good example. We talk of this as a portrait, but this was never commissioned by Robert Orme or his family. It was very much an initiative by Reynolds to show as an example of a heroic portrait that he would hang in his studio for prospective patrons to come and look at. So for me, it sits between that idea of, almost between genres, trying to be something of a history painting, showing the moment just after this battle when Orme is taking this kind of missive, this note about this defeat within the battle. And he sat for Reynolds, I think a few months after he returned to the UK, and decided to depict this moment because he was a sort of name that was in the news at the time, and he thought it would be kind of an interesting project or painting to show. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that idea of, and perhaps in your work as well, that the mode of referencing and taking from different sources and putting them together into one sort of work.
I think when you talk about that painting as well, the thing is that Reynolds didn't really like observation. He wanted everything to be high art, and that was his, that was the goal. He kind of frowned on the idea of, people just rendering for nature and stuff, which I do a bit as well. But I think, we think of Gainsborough and the idea that he used to make the landscape out of bits of broccoli, He used to do it all in his studio, and he used to light it with candles, and that whole idea of, plein air painting was not a thing. It wasn't a thing which was, it didn't have any idea of truth in it in the same way. Do you know what I mean? That the idea that these things were still carrying these moral and high ideals, but then also, it also ends up being stodgy, and it's also, in the end, how well is it painted? And in a way, when you talk about, what this painting is about, it's echoed also in other, Spanish painting and French painting at the time, and often done in a much more sophisticated, way. You think, so, but I mean, for me, I think now, look, if I go to look, when I'm looking at a painting and I go into a gallery and so I'm kind of interested, well, why is this painting being made in 2025, say? So what is it, what are the concerns of it? What is it trying to do? What does it want me to think about? And how is the artist considering the surface? How are they thinking about all the concerns which were everything, which this century wasn't about in a way? It's all the post 1902 period where suddenly the picture plane in paintings changed forever, is that those concerns are also there. But for me, I was told before, is that how you kind of get a piece of another artist and try and use it in a painting to evoke something is something I'm more interested in than actually naming it.
Can we talk about one painting in your show?
Okay.
Track and Turf, which is the diptych,
Okay.
which references Stubbs, but also references a Reynolds painting.
It does.
And maybe talk about how that sort of functions, in the way that actually you've referenced a particular detail from a Reynolds painting.
Yeah, I mean, there's two paintings. It's called Track and Turf. One is basically the date, 1754, the numbers falling from the sky into this kind of racing green kind of field, like a murky kind of field in Lincolnshire, in my head in 1754. And then, so I wanted to do a painting about Stubbs, which didn't include a Stubbs painting, because again, it's like this idea of trying to get an idea of Stubbs without it being trying to paint a bit of that or trying to paint one of his odd stiff figures holding on to a cart horse or something. And in a way, it was this kind of sadness of kind of horse portraiture, because in a way, animal horse portraiture is a kind of depiction of power and ownership, and that's what people wanted their horses painted, and also they loved to have, those paintings shown to other people. These are what they owned. This was an incredible racehorse they had, and it was all to do with that. So, in a way, with Reynolds, this painting, and a sister painting, which is in the Metropolitan, actually, there's another figure he has, which is standing much closer to a horse, but is pulling the horse down also, much more. So his boots are there, but the horse's head is in abeyance in a way. So I did use on a smaller panel a version of that, which is a kind of, it's very distressed looking painting, but the horse, it does have a horse's head in it. So I just, I always wanted just the idea of saying, okay, field, date, horse, and then it's Stubbs, because it's 1754 was when he was in those barns in Lincolnshire, drawing the skeletons of horses and dissecting them all on his own, and he ended up being the best horse painter, probably ever in a way, but it was like a very peculiar, sort of slightly spooky pursuit.
I think there's also other ways that you've kind of approached this, other sort of form, other ways of kind of using sort of different references, but also playing on that ambiguity as well, the ambiguity of space, of place. Is there another painting that you sort of actually really enjoyed producing in the show that you? Well,
there's a train of thought which ended up being 3 different paintings. I'll just include this story because I think it's kind of an interesting sort of fantasy kind of what I was talking about, the idea of the pre-Raphaelites is that that there's a whole point in time when I was growing up in the early 70s. My stepbrother's much older than me, about 40. He had his hair down to here. He had like brushed denim jacket and all that thing of heavy rock. And there was also this kind of fascination with the occult. It was massive. It was a really big thing. This crossover between Black Sabbath, early Zeppelin, and many other bands, but also there was a kind of obsession with the occult, and a serious occult, not just, not the idea of like magicians, but Aleister Crowley, for example, this late 19th century sort of philosopher / eccentric, brilliant mind, but also was obsessed with the idea of like bringing up these kind of Godhead rituals that could bring the devil into the incarnate, and so they were all obsessed with him. And he built this house on Loch Ness called Boleskine House, which then he did this ceremony in, which he tried to bring up this thing where you had to spend 9 days, and eventually the devil and his incarnate, whatever, followers come into the house, and he would speak with them, and you complete the whole ceremony, and he would disappear again. I think 7 days in, he got called to Paris for some reason, so he left. And the house was meant to be possessed from then on, and it's burnt down 4 times. But I was very interested in that moment. Then I found out that Jimmy Page, the guitar player of Led Zeppelin, bought that house and actually tried to live in it, but he couldn't really live in it. But he did record an extraordinary track in it called Boleskine House 1973, which is like some spooky, very disturbing thing. And then, when I was thinking about all this, that I remembered when I saw the Edward Burne-Jones show at Tate Britain, the last room of the show, there are all these tapestries, and some of you may have seen it, and it all said private collection. And when I asked the curator, I said, who owns these? He said, Jimmy Page owns them. So there's this idea that, it's this idea of the two things somehow coalescing, the idea of that in periods of time, I think the late 19th century was a great example, where people didn't really want to face reality. So they wanted to think about a different world, a more innocent world where values were different. And I think it's the idea of also, the idea in the early 70s, the idea of was a tough, grim period. The idea of trying to connect with a different sort of reality. A bit like when all the Lord of the Rings films came out in the 90s. Everyone was like, thank God for that. We don't have to think about, the Kuwait War or whatever was going on. So I'm just kind of interested in how those kind of things circle and come round. So I did make a painting called Avalon, which is based on Burne-Jones's 15-foot painting, which is called The Last Resting Place of King Arthur in Avalon, which he made in the last 10 years of his life when, as he described, because he'd gone out of fashion, and he used to say to people, the rage for me is over. But he was painting this painting until he died, and people who'd visit would think was he in the painting, or was he painting his own death, kind of thing. So I've included a reflection of that on an oak tree, and I felt that in my mind it kind of that became that thing of thinking about that period, and also thinking about making paintings myself in the 1980s when everyone was copying George Baselit when I was at college, So sometimes it's like significant, and sometimes it's completely arbitrary. But it's the idea of that subjectively sort of collaging these things together as ideas, which then makes me start to think about how to make the images. So it's always brainstorming away from depicting the obvious, in my head, anyway.
There's so much, it's interesting hearing you talk about that. I was thinking very much about actually this idea of history painting being a sort of adaptation of this idea of memory, and memory being something that actually, in a painterly form, is something that you can't really trust, It's not necessarily something about documents or something exactly the way it is, but also, I feel like this show, for you, is a little bit about kind of that idea of kind of casting back a memory to something that came before. It's perhaps a slight tangent, but we, in diaspora studies, we talk a lot about this as a discourse, about the idea of what a distant memory might be, of a certain kind of heritage or something like that. Is there something in that about, picking up this idea of memory as a form of escapism, perhaps, both in the mysticism that you've kind of referenced, but also music, perhaps, or this idea of melancholia as a way of kind of exploring some of those thoughts?
Yeah, I think so. Also, I think yes to that, but also I think it's this thing of how all I'm sort of saying is how different flavors of things affect different periods of time, and then how strong that was at a point, and now it's no longer there. I think that's it. And also I think with art making as well, there's a problem of how to make great art about a very difficult subject as well. Because I think if you look at all the art produced during the Vietnam War, for example, there's not a lot which stands up. Do you know what I mean? If you think about the idea at the time, it thought that was the most important thing to do, but yes, it may have been, but then the problem with that, of making a kind of specific thing about a particular event in a particular time, is it may not stand the test of time in terms of formally how that thing was made. That there's no particular interest in it. It's just the message. And I think that's another thing which is tricky. But I think, when we talk about music, expanding out music and the idea of different influences, because I felt that a big part of this show is to bring in one very enormous painting is called Rise Up, which is this speaker system, is that, when I grew up in Bristol, that there was a West Indian community there, and reggae and dub was like, it wasn't something which you kind of went to, it was just there continually, so it was part of my early life, and it was a part of affecting everyone in that city, in terms of who was young and interested in music, in terms of their interests and how that would go into the future. Do you know what I mean? But it wasn't a marginalized thing. It was in the center. Yeah. And then how music now, certain bits of music have now become marginalized again, or they're just something which you click on as choice. Whereas I think obviously pre-internet, there was a kind of more tribal allegiance to things which you had to find your way by thinking, well, I'm this, and I'm also, I'm kind of interested in that, but I think I'm going to go in with this lot because if I risk dressing up like that, you know what I mean? There was a different... Yeah. I don't think that's particularly great, but I think it's obviously very human in the way that previously...
Maybe that's a good way to round back to the idea of us being in this room, surrounded by paintings, by painters who are part of this club, this Royal Academy, in a way of trying to find a way of conforming to this idea of what a British painting and British art might be.
Well, I think also if you look above the rail at the top, you see the names in the arches. So these are at the time this gallery was built, these were the names which were put incarcerated into the building. And some of them now are, of course, very unknown or it dropped completely obscure, out of obscure artists, including the first director of the National Gallery. Eastlake is there somewhere, isn't he, I think?
Yeah, over there.
Is he there? Yeah.
Yeah.
So the first director of the National Gallery, Charles Eastlake, who was a painter to start with, and then kind of eased off with his own work as he just became more and more of a kind of very ambitious director, also included himself in the idea of, well, it's included when it was made, included within this context when it was still probably a little after him, but the idea that name is equal to the other names, and actually there's much fewer names than we actually recognize in terms of that. But I think, again, what we're witnessing now in terms of art history is this enormous shift in revisionists thinking about actually what we thought was art history 15 years ago is no longer still relevant in the same way. So I think that also, this in a way is a mausoleum as well as a museum in the way that it's constructing and showing a collection which at a point in time had a kind of significant trajectory in saying this is what happened. And now it's like, well, yes, but also there are all those others who aren't included here, which need to be then reaffirmed and put back into it. So, that's why I'm interested in that thing with Jose Maria Velasquez. He's a painter making art in Mexico City, roughly the same time as Cézanne, but it's kind of a fascinating thing to think about him in relationship to what was happening in Europe in 1840 to 1912, because then you see, here was someone who really had an incredible mind behind what he wanted you, the viewer, to think about when you look at his paintings.
Yeah, brilliant. I think that's the perfect place to end our conversation, Dexter. So I hope that's whet your tongue to come back next year in March when our Velasquez show opens. We welcome you all back then. But in the meantime, please join me in thanking Dexter for this talk this evening. Yeah, we'll applaud.
Thank you, Chris.